Thank you, Andrew, and morning, everyone. Really pleased to be here to have an opportunity to talk to you about the challenge we have as modellers to respond to the climate emergency. And just as an overview, I'll be talking a little bit about the recent floods, and they haven't finished, they're still going on. A little bit about our new flood strategy that we're hoping to publish after the budget on March the 11th. It's important that we do have the right strategy within the UK and England to take our approach to flood risk management forward in the right way, and to do that within the context of reducing carbon. Something maybe I haven't thought about much over the last few years, but increasingly have started to think about how that plays into our whole approach. So I'll be setting a few questions and thoughts at the end about what we can do differently, but we don't have an answer. But collectively, we might have the answer. So I'm looking for your ideas as well as sharing a few of our own. So what's going on at the moment? I don't know if any of you saw the TV programme last night, Britain Underwater. Hands up. Well, we really need more of you to watch that. So I'm not trying to promote ITV here, but do have a look at it, because I think it tells you one thing in particular. It tells you the human response to flooding. And I think all of us involved in flood risk management need to understand that human response. Why are we here? We're here to protect people and society from flood risk. And we need to understand how society reacts to flood risk in order to deliver our role effectively. So I would ask you to watch it, because it really brings across how different people respond differently. And there isn't a single way of responding to floods, as you may realise. So have a look at that. We are in a winter where we're seeing serious flooding. 4,600 homes have been flooded over the winter period through from November. But it's important to note that 128,000 have been protected from flooding. And that contrast, I think, reflects the efforts we've made in the Environment Agency, but also other risk management authorities, water companies, local authorities, have also made in terms of investment to protect people. But it's not only about protection, and I'll come on to some of the other resilience concepts a little bit later. So if we look at this autumn and winter, you'll remember Fish Lake near Doncaster on the River Don, a typical river flooding situation in lowland Britain. And lowland Britain's in a particular squeeze, because not only are river flows going up, but tidal levels are going up. And for areas like Fish Lake, which are influenced by tidal effects, that squeeze makes climate change and a changing situation doubly difficult in terms of flood risk management. And this is a community which hadn't been flooded for decades. But last November, we saw record levels on the River Don. We've then had Storm Dennis blowing its way through, bringing additional flooding. And on February the 16th, we had live a record number of flood warnings and severe flood warnings and flood alerts, our highest number ever issued, indicating the seriousness of the whole event across England, but also Wales and parts of Scotland. And you'll have seen the images on the television down the River Severn more recently. The barriers at Ironbridge, which became a focus for media attention. And those temporary barriers we put up at Ironbridge were a choice of the local community. They were given the opportunity for brick walls to give them that solidity of flood defence. But they chose not to go down that route because they wanted to protect the historic feeling of that location. And I think that brings us back to understanding community, society, and what's required. It isn't always what we might think of as being required as engineers. And engaging with communities is an important part of what we do. Also on that picture is George Eustace, Secretary of State at DEFRA. And myself and colleagues have been working in London over the last few weeks, keeping ministers appraised of what's been happening on the ground, and also reacting to their particular needs and exasperation at times over what's happening on the ground. It's important to realise that if politicians don't understand what flooding is all about, don't understand the options and the science behind it and the engineering behind it, they're not going to make good decisions. So we all have an opportunity to raise issues locally and nationally with politicians, with funders, with communities, so that they do understand what's happening and what the solutions might be. And at this very moment, we are still seeing flooding in the Erinews washlands, just downstream of Fish Lake, just before the Humber estuary. And communities there are isolated, surrounded by floodwaters, and there are still 100 homes flooded in villages in that location, and it'll take some days before we dry them out through major pumping efforts. So communities may flood very quickly, may dry out very quickly. Some may be surrounded by water for weeks. And in terms of Somerset moors and levels, back in 2014, even months. And each community will have a different response to that and a different need. So flooding is with us. I think if anyone was to say to me after 30 years experience in the agency that it isn't getting worse, I'd be able to give them a few examples of why I believe it is. And that's about climate change. And we need to really understand what we're going to do differently in future in our group of modellers dealing with flood risk going forward. Those significant flood events we've had over the years, I think one that I want to come back to particularly is the 2007 summer floods, which were mainly a surface water flooding event back in June and July in 2007. And that's seen the most serious flooding we've had in the last 100 years or so across the UK. Now, in 2007, cities like Hull were inundated, and Hull in particular is low-lying. It depends on pumped solutions to get the water away from the city, from the drains, but it also depends on good river management and good coastal management. So it has a bit of everything. And the issue there, I think, is well set out by the council leader at the time. Both the north-south divide that we've been hearing about, and it's interesting, when we've looked back at our data for the last 6 years, when we've had £2.6 billion to invest in flood risk management, we've spent £61 for every person in the north of England and £37 for every person in the south of England. And if you're in the squeezed Midlands, it's just £35 a person. So what we do is respond to where the risk is worst. The investment we make is rigorously applied in terms of getting the best in payback in terms of flood risk reduction. What I would say over the last 6 years is we've done relatively little on surface water investment relative to river and coastal flood defences. And there are some reasons for that in terms of the funding mechanisms, but I think there are also some reasons for that in terms of the way we think about surface water flooding, and we work together as a collaborative whole across the various partners. Some barriers which get in the way of us delivering a good result for surface water. What we're hoping is that the budget will announce a significant 6-year programme going forward. The Conservative manifesto had a 6-year budget programme of £4 billion, so up from the current 2.6 billion over the last 6 years. But even that may not be enough to deal with the challenges we face in the climate emergency. What we are expecting is that we will be expecting to spend relatively more on coastal flooding and surface water flooding in the next 6-year capital programme on investment, and relatively less on river flooding, even though recently what we've seen in the news is principally river flooding. So the challenges are there, but our route forward, I think, has to be slightly different in terms of what we focus on. I think surface water, relative to river flooding and coastal flooding, has over the last 5 or 6 years been a little bit undercooked. I think we've had a lot of initiatives, a lot of talk around surface water at government level and at local level, but it hasn't played through into shifting protection of homes and properties in the way we have on the rivers and the coast. And it'd be interesting in the question session as to whether or not you've got any views on why that might be the case and what we can do differently. We are making some additional investment in surface water modelling. and grants have been made available to local authorities to improve their surface water modelling very recently. But it is a few £1,000,000 rather than tens of millions or hundreds of millions. And I think we need to recognise the scale of the challenge and refocus some of our effort on surface water. It's very clear that if we take a science-based approach to looking at emergencies and flood risk, then surface water is just as justifiable as other types of flooding. And these are the statistics from the National Risk Assessment. So this is the government's evaluation of all of the risks we face and whether or not they're pandemics, natural disasters, or man-made disasters. And if you were to look at the 2016 National Risk Assessment, which included surface water flooding for the first time, you would have seen in the top right-hand corner of the matrix of risk and severity, the issue that most worried government was pandemics. So what we're seeing now in terms of the coronavirus is something we've always been worried about at a national scale coming along. And that's why a lot of the preparations are in place amongst the emergency services to respond to it. Because once we have a risk on the National Risk Assessment, there's an obligation then to start planning to how do you respond to that in an emergency. And it's always better to avoid an emergency, and building flood schemes is a great way of avoiding emergencies, but you still need a great incident response. Not all risk can be managed out. And for me, surface water is the one where I'm most worried, because I think it's the one event that could come along and lead to the deaths of tens, if not hundreds of people. We don't lose many lives in floods now in England. I think a lot of that is down to awareness. It's down to the skill of the emergency services and the quality of the flood warnings and forecasting that we do. But underground flooding, which is often the case in surface water, and there are many examples across Europe, particularly in France, where tens of people have died in surface water flood events. And my worry is just around the corner. It's a case of when, not if, we get that type of event in central London or other areas where there are basement living, car parks underground, transport systems underground. They are not all flood protected. And we had mentioned earlier the Birmingham flood event. And I think our overall approach to surface water emergencies is relative to floods on the coast, poor. It's not good. We can't forecast. If we go back to this slide, the main difference is our inability to forecast effectively on surface water flood events. That means we can't have that preparation, that avoidance of risk early on. But it's not only that, it's also that ability to work collaboratively across water companies, local government and the Environment Agency to invest in schemes which cover a range of flood risk activities and initiatives. We tend to work in silos. It's difficult to integrate. But if you're living in a house and you're flooded, you don't care about any of that. You're just worried about what's happened to you and are the public services doing the right thing to help you. But of course, there is a challenge on each individual to do something differently. It's not just about the public services. So our house is on fire. What are we going to do about it? What are you doing about it? Last October, we committed as the Environment Agency to net zero carbon by 2030. And last October, that seemed fairly bold. 6 months later, it seems sort of just what you'd expect from any public organisation or reasonable private sector organisation to be aiming for. I think there has been a shift in mindset and belief that something has to happen. But in setting ourselves this target, we don't know how we're going to get there. This is an ambition which we will have to work out along the way. But we have used robust methodologies to identify what we need to do, and we're particularly working with the supply chain to get there. because overall 77% of our carbon emissions are with our supply chain, not our core activity in the Environment Agency. And most of that is construction around flood defence schemes and operating flood defence schemes. So that supply chain has to be part of the answer. And modelling is part of that supply chain and also an activity we do within the organisation. And at the moment, when we're doing our modelling, I don't think we're thinking about carbon at all. We don't think it's our responsibility. We don't think it really matters. We don't think it's significant in the round. But I think all of us need to start moving our mindsets to thinking differently about that. We've got to take 45% of our carbon out by 2030 and find ways of offsetting the remaining 55%. And that gets us on the target trajectory for the Paris Agreement. But we're also starting to think about what Microsoft have already committed to, which is no carbon organisations by 2050, which is even more of an ambition. But that burning house that Greta talks about is something we all need to start owning and dealing with. I mentioned earlier our flood strategy that we're hoping to publish after the budget. We are trying to shift our own thinking, but I think we also need to start shifting your thinking. And you need to start influencing our solutions and ways of working. So last week there was a Association of Drainage Authority conference in the UK, and the head of the Dutch Water Authority came across. And we were presenting our flood strategy, which was about resilience. His view was there are three important issues with flood risk management: protect, protect, protect. Now, sometimes things get lost in translation, but I think if you're in Holland, where 60% of the land area is below sea level, that means 60% of your economy, then you do approach flood risk in a different way to a country where 5 million out of 65 million are at risk of flooding. And your investment choices can be different. Interestingly, the Dutch do come across to talk to us about the resilience bits of the overall equation, which are not protection. So they look to our emergency response and what we do, and look to learn from us, because their levels of protection mean they don't get to practice that very often. But they know their defences will be overtopped, breached at some point. What I think we're presenting in our strategy is we can't keep building our way out of the flood risk challenge going forward. The walls can't keep getting higher. The pipes can't keep getting bigger. We can engineer a lot, but it's not the solution to all flood risk management. We do need to think more effectively about catchment-based solutions, natural solutions, not only at a very tactical level, which can only achieve a marginal improvement in flood risk management, but more strategically. And along the coast in particular, setting defences back, creating new salt marshes, just uses natural processes at a strategic level to manage flood risk. Inland, peat bog restoration in particular, offers a real opportunity in catchments such as those in West Yorkshire to rebalance some of the flood risk. But it will take years to get those solutions effectively working. They're not something you can apply in a few years as you can with concrete walls. But they have to be part of the answer, and they have to be argued for with local communities. Local communities will often want an instant response to a flood that's affected them. That may not be the discussion we need to have with them going forward. In some cases it will, but in some cases it needs to be a more nuanced discussion, because that's the only way to manage the climate emergency in terms of flood risk, the adaptation to what's happening. If 5 million of us in England are at risk of flooding at the moment, we need to recognise that 40 million of us live in properties whose services are likely to be affected by severe flooding. Power, transport, telecommunications, hospitals. 2/3 of the infrastructure is at flood risk in England, in any one location. So we need that to be effectively protected. And there have been great improvements in certain sectors, the water industry in particular. The flooding we had on the Severn very recently was more severe in places than 2007, but Mythe Water Treatment Works, Walham Electricity Power Station Distribution Network, both of which flooded in 2007, were kept dry. That's because of investment in infrastructure protection by those industries. And finally, we need communities, individuals, to be talking about flood risk, understanding flood risk, if we're to have a shared agenda on dealing with flood risk going forward. If we're going to get a third more rainfall in the next 50 years, we will struggle to keep up levels of protection that we've got at the moment. We believe we need today to spend £1 billion a year on flood protection to keep pace with climate change. That's not to eat into the risk we've currently got, just to keep up with it. And that will go up every 5 years. And there's a limit to what can be done through engineering. Now, my team deals with flood modelling, coastal, inland. It deals with planning applications. It deals as a client with consultants. And we do modelling ourselves and do hydrological risk assessment ourselves. And we manage large data sets and hundreds, thousands of individual models, sometimes on a daily basis during floods when we're doing flood forecasting for multiple communities. And as I said earlier, I don't think we're thinking about carbon at the moment. We will still need to solve typical modelling questions, some simple, but most being really complex. And understanding how our complex systems and our flood embankments will operate under severe loading is becoming an increasing question for us as we see longer and wetter winters emerging, which create more risk for embankments, some of which are 400 years old. We've no idea what's in them. We may be able to look at the surface and think that looks really good or really bad, but at the core, we don't know what's happening. So breaches will happen, and it's difficult to predict where. We will have to continue to think about uncertainty in our models, focusing particularly on rainfall and hydrology as the biggest uncertainty to worry about, rather than the schematization of our models. But I think the context within which all of that modelling work is done is something that all of us as modellers need to start incorporating within our thinking and our preparation and our activity. Thinking more about our individual model within a catchment context. How can it help others or link into others? How can it look for a solution remote from the point of the problem rather than just at the point of the problem? How will our modelling deal with the carbon we use? Not only in terms of the direct activity, but in the solutions we're thinking about. If we're modelling pipe networks and the solution just seems to be bigger pipe networks, rather than an option which may seem slightly odd, different, if you're not looking at carbon at the initial stages as well as effectiveness and cost, I think we're missing a trick as modellers to advise others over the options that they've got. And it's about people. So are you explaining the results of your modelling to communities, to clients in a way which makes them understand the issues? And are you understanding the politics within which all of this occurs? And politicians are really influential in terms of directing how we change things, but only if we provide them with the evidence and guidance to take them in the right direction. So that context, I think, is something all of us can absorb to improve our modelling. And a degree of humility to understand that local people who have to live with flooding are often the best source of information and the people you should be seeking to convince that your solutions are the right ones. This is a previous chairman of the Environment Agency getting some sound advice from a local resident. So coming to a conclusion, what does this mean for us? Well, we've got to use less carbon in the modelling life cycle. And the next speaker will be talking about some ideas which may help us. Whether that's in data collection, different ways of collecting data which use less carbon, less processing, different processing, and working together differently. It'd be interesting if the coronavirus gets us to think differently about home working and remote working, but still collaboration and delivering collectively. It may be a nudge, something that comes out of what could turn into a very bad situation, something positive about how we can work differently. Many of the staff in the Environment Agency work at home regularly, and I've certainly changed my behaviour from when I started work 30 years ago to what I do now and how I work. For the last 4 years, I've not used a single car mile to do my job. I've walked, I've trained, I've bussed, I've taxied. Now, that change, maybe I'm lucky I can do that, but it is possible. And I wouldn't have thought that 10 years ago. I'd have been wedded to my car to do all of that. So I think we can change behaviours and do things differently. Low carbon solutions from the start. I don't think any of us should be accepting or delivering modelling commissions which don't talk about carbon at the outset, with the person setting the objectives for the project or the task or the client. And you may find it a difficult conversation, but I don't think any of us should avoid the burning house that Greta talks about just because it's difficult. We should be grasping the opportunity to do things differently. And that may be asking clients or those setting the objectives to think differently about the solutions and who they work with to get there. But it may be technical innovation which gets us doing things in a sharper, different way to use less carbon and come up with more evidence to help people make really great decisions. So just in conclusion, a few thoughts which we might come back to in the question time. Floods are about people, and they resonate at a political level. Where's Boris has been a constant refrain in the media. Now, I'd like to ask, what can Boris actually do to prevent a flood that the emergency services, the army, the Environment Agency, local government, water companies can't do? But people want the politicians to recognise their situation, and politicians who ignore those at risk of flooding, like George Bush during Hurricane Katrina, it comes back to bite them. We must think and act on carbon. And as I say, I don't have the answers, but I have the expectation and ambition that we need to do things differently. We must have more adaptive solutions for the future, not build ourselves into corners. Our new flood strategy that's coming out will set a tone which is about resilience, which includes protection, but includes education, natural measures, working with partners in different ways, getting planning operating in a different way as the trajectory forward. And all of this at the end of the day depends on good collaboration between all those involved. Communities, engineers, scientists, politicians, funders. We all need to and can work better together to get the right answers to respond to the climate emergency that's in front of us. Thank you.